Okay, today is June 11th, 2014, and this is the 8th in a series of classes on Lyndon LaRouche's economics textbook titled, So, You Wish to Learn All About Economics? The class is available, the book's available in the video description for the video, and if you go to the playlists that you'll find this video in, you can find the rest of the whole series of classes. Talking to YouTube here. So this is the last class. What we're going to do is start by going over the homework responses from the last homework. We're going to review the whole book, which is, I was astonished going through it at how much is in this book. It really is a masterpiece. And then talk about what's next, both for economics in particular, and then with this educational series that we've been doing at this typical time on Wednesdays. So to start things off, the first of the homework questions from this last session was to create, we did this collaboratively, we created together, I'm pulling the picture up here. Let me switch over to the picture view for you guys. There we go. So what you're seeing here is the chart that I showed at the last class comparing electricity consumption and GDP per capita. And that was for all the countries in the world. What we did for the homework was people chose some of their own countries of interest, and then we put together what people had chosen, and this is the chart that came up. So as you can see, it shows the same trend, that if you compare electricity consumption measured is as watts of electricity per capita, and you compare that with GDP, and yes, most of the books about why GDP is a bad measure, but there's some other ones. We can make some more charts. That might be a project for you to take up after this class. But using this basic comparison, you see really clearly that if you don't have electricity, you're going to be poor, which shouldn't be a stunning conclusion, but here you've got it. The other part of the homework was to do the same thing with rail. Here's a chart showing rail per capita because, well, anyway, same thing. On the x-axis is the number of meters of rail per person, and then the y-axis shows GDP. That country way over there on the right is Australia, which has an astonishing amount of rail per capita, which really surprised me. Since when I think of Australia, I think of road trains or whatever they're called, like the semi truck, but instead it's got like 4 trailers behind it. That's what they do that in Australia, and I figured it's because they didn't have any rail, but that's not true. They've got a lot. Let's look at this again without Australia, just to see the trend again. And also Argentina now is the dot on the right. So you can see that Argentina is a country that's invested a lot into its rail networks, although its economy is. The other part of this is that one of the problems with GDP is the extent to which financial services make up a portion of that. And Argentina is hardly in the good graces of the international financial world, which is going to unfairly depress their GDP when we're using this, faulty measure to try to look at this. So that was good. That was putting together the different countries people chose, and people reflected on that, about what it meant that Argentina had a large amount of rail, that GDP is pushed up unfairly due to financial use, and then also just some countries, how low the amount of electricity use is per capita, which is really astonishing. Just to read off the spreadsheet here, the spreadsheet's in the video description also. The per capita electrical power rate in the US is almost 1,400 watts per capita. So if you think about, a 100-watt light bulb, which are now illegal, but if you can find some old ones, 14 of those light bulbs, that's the amount of electricity used per capita in the US on average. The lowest amount in any of the countries that were chosen here, some of the lower ones included Mexico, which only had 200, Egypt, 160, Vietnam, 50, and the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, 20. So 20 watts of electricity per capita in the Côte d'Ivoire. That's like less than a light bulb, and this is astonishingly low. And it's no surprise that the economy is not very, people don't live well. So that was the first question. The second question was about looting. In the previous reading from the book, Lynn, when talking about infrastructure, talks about the value of infrastructure, and then he goes right into how it's been destroyed intentionally by agents attacking the US. And one example he gave was the looting of the New Haven Railroad, where this occurred decades ago. People had bought up control of the railroad, stolen from it, and then left it to die. And the question for the homework was to find a similar example from more recent times. In a masterpiece of understatement, one of the homework respondents said, in 1984, private investor Carl Icahn launched an unwelcome takeover of TWA, unwelcome or hostile, as Trans World Airlines. I'm going to read this response. It's very good. He pledged to make the company profitable, but instead he stripped the company of its assets and made profit for himself. For example, he took the company public on the stock market, which netted him over $450 million in personal profit. The same deal put the company $540 million in debt. He told everyone in the company that he would purchase 100 new planes in the later part of that decade, and instead purchased 12. Then he sold the firm's exclusive London routes to American Airlines for $450 million, destroying the airline's strategic position in the market and its long-term viability. He took assets that had a future potential, and he ate them up in the present. TWA went through 2 bankruptcies in the early 90s and a third one in the early 2000s, effectively killed by Icahn. So it's a very good example of primitive accumulation, of looting, of using potential for the future and consuming it today instead. So that was good. Now the third question, I'd like to, Anastasia's not on, so I'll have to read hers for her. The third question was to write a story from the future. The end of chapter 9, LaRouche discusses how cities ought to be built in the future, and the homework was the assignment was to write a short story about a day in the life of a city-dwelling family in one of the new cities in the year 2050. So there were 3 good answers, and I'm going to read all 3. Well, I'll read this one, and then people who wrote the other 2 will read those. So Anastasia wrote, after the total annihilation of Wall Street in 2014, with the passage of the 4 Laws to Save the Economy bill in both houses, also known as the LaRouche Law, a new era began that had never been thought up for mankind thus far. The US, Russia, and China began an immediate cleaning up, which took a few years to do, along with sending a few bankers to jail, probably an understatement, and the President of the United States as well. Maglev Rail finally began in the US after much negotiations with China and Russia on different models to use. New cities were built, most named after scientific and universal leaders. So a Boeing worker in JFK, Washington, in the year 2050, having remembered his father's grueling days at Boeing, was very relieved that the company was able to survive through the Great Meltdown so that he could be part in building the vacuum tunnels for the Bering Strait, which to his delight was to be opened to the public today. He and his wife decided that they wanted to catch the link rail to Moscow so they could see their 16-year-old son, who was studying at the new University of Vernadsky. They left their home and caught rail to the center of the city. They wanted to get a good breakfast, since they would be going a good few hours in a different time zone. So they stopped at the best cafe and pub in town, the Jerry Adams. It was owned by an Irish family who, once freed of the British, wanted to live in the town named after their favorite Catholic U.S. president, John Kennedy. So they moved to John F. Kennedy, Washington. They got the works: local-made sausage, bacon, eggs with baked bean toast, yum. Once filling themselves silly with a full Irish breakfast, they left to the grand opening of the Bering Strait Tunnel. They bought their ticket to Alaska, which linked up to the tunnel opening. It was about a 3-hour trip on the older maglev trains. The place was crowded. Everyone wanted to go to the opening. Children, seniors, students, engineers, scientists, you name it, from all around the world. Optimism filled the air. Arriving in the maglev tunnel in East Teller, Alaska, the president gave a fantastic presentation on the importance of high energy flux density and the progress of man. Taking the rail to Russia was part of the unified effort to uplift man to higher evolutions. The Boeing worker felt such a sense of pride. His wife felt such a sense of pride in what they contributed to society because it gave meaning to their parents, who fought through the final battle with the British Empire and they knew that they were going to create a better society for mankind. So yes, we got two more also. Choose your order there.
Okay. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's sort of like a in a sense it's kind of parodic, but it's towards something that honestly we're going to have to deal with in terms of an artistic representation, I think. Okay, so bear with me. All right, so because it takes place in Mongolia, and which is where there's going to be a huge amount of growth, but I don't know how to pronounce any Mongolian names, but I looked up authentic Mongolian names, so. But it's a serious idea, despite the light treatment. Okay, Besud Sakyagin Elbegdorj woke up early on the morning of his son's graduation from college in the New Silk Road city of New Silk Road in Mongolia. Okay, because I imagine that there's going to be a lot of cities called New Silk Road in various, in various languages. So the university, having been founded in the same year that the city was founded, 2025, was commemorating its 25th year in existence. Besud and his wife, having eaten breakfast, left their home and walked a couple blocks to the subway. Within minutes, they had arrived at the university campus in the middle of the city. They arrived in time to see their son conduct a morning voice sectional in preparation for the grand festivities of the afternoon. The students diligently pressed forward in Beethoven's Ninth, to the amazement of Besud and his wife, and I'm just not going to try that name. So, Besud and his wife, who found the flowering of classical culture to be so deeply gratifying in contrast to their own youth that they each wept silently. As his son, Ganbatar, which means the Steel Prince, okay, strode confidently across the stage to receive his degree in thermonuclear fusion studies, a vision suddenly came before Besud's eyes. Two images presented themselves to him at once. In one image, he saw Ganbatar in his youth. Besud guided the small boy to lay his hand upon the shockingly cool exterior of a massive vacuum tube, the construction of which Besud had directed as a foreman on the project. Simultaneously, before Besud's intellect glowed a plasma incorporeal, pulsating and rotating. It grew unceasingly. The vision passed. He cocked his head back and he laughed with a defiant joy, his wife in arms. The end. Right, go ahead.
You can just send it to the Mongolian numbers.
I think you're right.
I didn't create a new city. I figured, since Somalia was never developed, it would just be the capital city. So it's July 1st, 2050, and in Somalia they are celebrating Independence Day, 90 years since British and Italian rule. The Aden family decides to take their 3 kids to the museum dedicated to Somali revolutionaries. Mom and Dad, who both managed the museum, planned for the day. In the morning, the family took a high-speed rail to the south side of Mogadishu, where the museum is located. This is incredible because never before the turn of the century did Somalia have any serious transportation, none at all. The rail line hugged the coast of the city, so looking out one side you see the ocean, and the other side a view of the city, not to mention the train was super quiet so it didn't disturb the cities. There was an overwhelming sense of pride in the parents to see their city being renovated. They sift through beautiful rose gardens open to the public and newly constructed universities that was built so beautiful it was the center for scientific and cultural thought. The family took a pit stop in downtown Mogadishu, and surprisingly, in front of the city hall, which was modeled to look like the Acropolis, and had several replicas of Greek sculptures, including Prometheus chained to a rock, was a performance being held of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The 3 kids were overcome by joy. Anyways, the family plans to take a bus ride to the museum for the duration of the trip. They get to the museum and the children lay eyes on a beautiful building with white pillars and rows of roses which guide you to the entrance. And once you enter, engraved on the museum wall is a quote from Homer's Iliad, which reads, "And what he greatly thought, he nobly dared." How befitting for this museum dedicated to men and women who fought for this nation. On this very special day, Mom and Dad tell their 3 children that their grandparents fought to free this nation and give you a future you are deserving of. This left an incredible impression on the children, which helped shape their lives.
So these stories they're real treats. It's really wonderful to get this sort of detailed, thought through idea of what the future will be like. It can't get you beyond the struggle against the past. Well, this might come as a letdown after those stories, but question 4 is about what percent of GDP is related to financial services. Anyway, no, to get a sense of how, because chapter 10 of the book is about inflation. And Lynn says, look, you don't have to worry about inflation. The real cause of inflation is Wall Street sucking and sifting off money from every legitimate activity, creating monetary claims on actual services and production, which is like a tax on everybody. So the question was to figure out the size, to estimate the size of this. But there's some very good points were made. First off, the specific statistics were that 5% of the labor force works in financial services, which accounts for 8% of GDP, supposedly. Yet the conventional funds of these financial services were over 300% of GDP. These amounts of money don't make a whole lot of sense. And then, here's a really good point, is that so many other industries which tie into useless financial activity aren't going to be counted directly as that, but still their GDP or their economic contributions really mean that actually are a part of that. So, for example, buildings built for financial services, services for the financial sector. Take as an example the Facebook IPO. Any contribution of Facebook or similar information technology companies to GDP is essentially fictionalized by the manipulations of the stock market by Wall Street shitheads. It's like Amazon for years never made a profit, but it had this huge market capitalization. How did the capital gains on those stocks count into the GDP, for example? And it's on a company that never made any money. Also, how about healthcare? What percent of the money expended on healthcare is for healthcare versus what percentage is waste? And I think I think the estimate I often see is that 30% of healthcare expenditures is to deal with insurance companies, their profit, and then all the extra clerical work for filling out the paperwork and submitting it. So, okay, so that was the last homework there. So now let's take a quick tour of this wonderful book and then talk about where we're going to go next. So, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. It just right from the beginning, it's unlike any other economics book. Right from the beginning, Lynn makes a strong polemic that there are no neutral academic economists. That doesn't really exist. People are, at least the major players, they're not in an ivory tower. Like if you compare the work of Leibniz, of Franklin, of Hamilton, of Carey, and of Liszt, the work that they did to create nations, to develop nations, the work, well, specifically Franklin and Leibniz, on promoting science itself, you compare that with Smith or Bentham, who had an outlook of the human species that was degraded and whose specific goal is to destroy the colonies in the United States. It's all political. So much of economic theory is political PR. Just like some journalist who is, promoting the government line on something, these economists might be a little bit better paid. Maybe they have to study longer in school before they get a job as an economist, as opposed to a journalist or a talking head. But much of it is the same thing. And he says right from the beginning, most of what people think of as economics is monetarism. Money's part of an economy, but when people think economics, they pretty much just think monetarism. Where's the economy? It's not there at all. Where's the physical economy? That's the real science. Monetarism is a part of it, and it's become the other way around. So in chapter 1, Lynn talks about how economics itself is a very powerful science. That economy is about production. The study of how the productive powers of labor are increased, that is a science. That's economic science, the science of physical economy. He introduced those terms that we use so much later, of work, of power, of energy flux density, and capital intensity, which you remember from some weeks ago, it was sort of tough to pull the two apart. And we came up with examples to fill out Lynn's statement that a limit of one would prevent the application of the other. So, for example, Ken gave the example of the Soviet Union, where there were scientific discoveries reflecting higher energy flux densities, but there was no civilian economy to provide the capital intensity to make them actually go into practice. And on the other side, we saw the video that Daniel found of Charlie Chaplin demonstrating an excessive investment of capital intensity without representing any higher energy flux density. It was, the automatic lunch feeding machine that, fed Charlie Chaplin all this food. Just totally a high capital intensity, but there's obviously no benefit with that. And then the homework from that chapter was to look at different kinds of energies and powers. Get a sense of how much power did the building that you were in use? How much electricity does your house use in a year? How much energy is in a gallon of gas? How long could a gallon of gas power your house? Just to sort of have some sort of meaningful notion of what these things were. In chapter 2, we got at the beginning of Mr. LaRouche's wonderful measure for global economy, as well as the whole concept of the difference between trying to make money individually, individual profits, adding up individual profits to describe a whole economy, and trying to think about a characteristic of an economy as a whole. And real economic growth means changing a global characteristic of the economy as a whole. It'll be reflected in individual profits, but are you changing the economy as a whole? And Lynn leaps into the fray on sociology and anthropology, and he says that you can measure the superiority of one culture over another. There's a metric for this. It's called potential relative population density. That nations, only societies which progress, are qualified to survive and prosper. Only societies which develop increasing levels of potential relative population density deserve to and will continue to exist. That you have to organize your society if it's not doing that, or you're not going to be around. The only scientific basis for measuring economic value comes from a rate of increase of potential relative population density, he says. So this is also where he makes fun of the limits to growth. And the book, the idea, the concept in the limits to growth is that they make a model for the whole economy. They give pessimistically low values of the amounts of resources. And most importantly, they model the economy as it is, meaning no fundamental technological improvements. Then they run their model, and they say that after a couple of decades, mankind's doomed. Right, there will be so much pollution, we're going to be dead. Then they say, in their book, they said, let's say we develop new ways of dealing with pollution. Then they say, okay, later we're going to run out of food, and we're all going to be dead. Then they say, okay, let's run it again. Let's say agriculture got better. Then they say, we're going to run out of other resources, and we're going to be dead. Now, instead of realizing that because every time they make an adjustment, society, prospers longer, instead of realizing that, as long as we keep doing that, we'll be fine, they say, forget. Mankind is fundamentally doomed. We're going to eat ourselves and pollute ourselves out of existence, so we should do that slower. They're not pretending that they figured out some way to avoid this problem. They're just saying, let's die slower by having less people. That's their great idea. Now, Lynn points out that what these guys actually proved is that we should be investing in fusion and building nuclear power plants like there's no tomorrow, because that is what society needs to survive, and without it, we're not going to make it. That's what their book actually showed, but it's not what... He made a funny quip. He said, perhaps for them, the death of the human species is preferred to admitting the incompetence of systems analysis. Of course, they want the death of the human species. I mean, this is this, Malthus thing. So he has a lot of fun with that. And then he opens up chapter 3 with a beautiful quote. Chapter 3 is about the thermodynamics of political economy. And he opens up with this really fun quote. It's poetic, where he talks about the laws of thermodynamics. And he says, contrary to the thoughts of those silly people who believe the laws of thermodynamics as taught to them, closer reflection reveals that these are laws of the legislative, not the scientific variety. You might ask people, what year were the laws of thermodynamics passed? Are the laws of thermodynamics constitutional? Should they be amended? Should they be repealed? Are they true? Those laws, just to for those anyway, the first law is about energy. It says that in processes that take place, energy can be transformed between different forms, but it is not created and it's not destroyed. So, for example, if you throw a ball up in the air, it has a lot of motion, it has motion energy at the bottom. When it reaches the top and it stops and it's about to start falling again, it has potential energy, same amounts of energy. That's the first law. The second law is the one that says the whole universe is decaying. It's basically saying that whenever there's a transformation of energy from one sort to another, it never becomes more organized. In general, it becomes less organized. The entropy, the disorder of the universe is always increasing. That's what the second law says. Now, this came out of a study of, the potential efficiency of heat-powered machines that Carnot had done to figure out, what role the steam engine could play in the economy. You don't know anything about the entire universe from studying steam engines. In fact, it's pretty presumptuous to say you know anything about the whole universe at all in that kind of specific of a way. The universe developing as a whole is one thing, but that we can apply our physics as we understand it here on one planet to everything, like dark matter, it's a bit silly. So these laws of thermodynamics, they're actually both untrue from a human standpoint. The third one's not interesting. So the first one, this constant amount of energy, well, that's not true. When the law was passed, nuclear energy didn't exist. Obviously, after E equals mc squared and Curie and the development of nuclear power, if you tried to add up all the energy that existed on the Earth, your number was way off. You didn't include uranium, you didn't include thorium. So, the amount of energy is fixed, they say, but it actually just increased because of the creative powers of the mind. That's how Vernadsky would see that. The energy that exists just increased. Someone might say it was always there, but we didn't know about it, but that's what's important. What is the universe from the standpoint of our practice in it? The second law is just silly. It's really not worth even it's not really worth addressing too directly. So then, maybe we can talk about that more in the discussion period. There's more to say on that. Chapter 4 is on economic value. And this is where the letters came in, and the bars, the bar diagrams, where Lynn broke up the production into these different categories, like C, V, D, S, and S prime, where C was the production that was consumed in maintaining the productive process itself. V was the production that was consumed by the workers who were part of the productive process itself. So the guy working at a steel mill, when he has lunch, that would be part of V. The machinery at the steel mill, wherever that's produced, would be C. D is basically, D is overhead. So overhead included things that were useful, as we discussed. Teachers are part of overhead. From the standpoint of the productive part of the economy, teachers don't physically produce anything. We still want them. Doctors, part of overhead. Pimps, overhead, not useful. Advertising executives, overhead. So there was a lot of overhead. Military is overhead. Policemen are overhead. And then we also looked at S prime, the potential for growth in the economy, the free energy. And then Lynn talks about the importance of increasing the free energy of the economy, even while the capital intensity, the amount of C for V is also increasing. From the standpoint of these categories, it became a lot easier to address the question from Chapter 2 about what capital intensity was. Because now you could just write C over V. And if you knew what it meant, it's a very... And then that part of the homework there was trying to figure out how much of the economy was C and V and D and S prime, which was really tough. So there were different approaches taken to that. One of them was that for V, people looked at the amount paid to productive workers. So pick categories of the economy that count as productive, find their average salary, look at that as total in the economy, and that would be a way of figuring out how much V made in the economy. C was kind of tough because it would be maybe with more looking and a lot more data analysis, you could get a sense of how much capital investment was made into businesses. And then overhead, we discovered, was most of the economy. One breakdown was that for GDP, it's a bad number, 22% of GDP came from production, which includes McDonald's as an assembly job, with the shift of, well, yeah, that's just like somebody assembling, a pacemaker, somebody assembled a hamburger, whatever. It's same kind of thing, building a house, whatever, building a house, building a hamburger, same thing. So McDonald's is included in that. Well, actually, that might be a service. Or, that actually might count as production. I don't know. Manufacturing, yeah.
Apparently this year, 50% of all U.S. earnings are coming from financial investments.
Wow.
Really?
Huh.
The whole economy.
U.S. earnings?
Yeah.
I wonder if earnings means, you mean like salary, like personal earnings?
Like what you
Things like-
file on your income tax?
Yeah, like the salaries. The personal income of all Americans, like 50% of what they earn is just all from financial
Wow.
assets.
I'm going to consider how many make nothing from financial assets. That really lets you know how much some people are making. So, I mean, it was fun getting into that, because trying to get some specifics about the economy, it's something that I think we learned in this class is something you can actually do. It might be very tough to get the right numbers. Somebody had written that the first step would be to to burn down the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BS with an L in the middle. Burn down the building, eliminate the concept of GDP, send engineers around to get a real estimate of what our productive powers were. We would need that, because we found out how hard it was to try to estimate and figure out the things that we actually would need to know to measure the economy. Because the statistics are being measured with a totally different basis of what should be looked at. So it's way off. Also in that chapter, Lynn laid out the 3 areas of science he thought most important: plasmas, coherent radiation, SDI type things, and biology as biology. This is also where he talked about third world nations needing to leapfrog and actually trying to find a specific area of expertise or specialty to develop in. Otherwise, they'll always be developing. And have a plan of becoming an expert in something. Use some of that S prime, create S prime, and then use that for something cutting edge. He also talked about how your language culture fosters and prevents the ability to have profound thoughts. So this is where we looked at in the homework transitive verbs versus intransitive verbs. We looked at subjunctives from the standpoint of Lynn's emphasis on the need for transitive verbs and the subjunctive to be essential for thinking as a real scientist, for developing hypotheses, and getting outside of the nominalism, the noun and adjective-based world of Aristotle, and getting into the physical world of Brunelleschi, Kuhse, Kepler, the people represented, exemplified by the triads Lynn's discussed. And he ends it by saying that the real proof of science as practice, like the most fundamental proof that you can get, like how do you prove something? Aristotle or Euclid say, well, you start with some assumptions, and then if you show how you can derive something from those assumptions, that's how you proved it. If the initial assumptions were right, how do you prove that? Lynn says that economics is the highest proof of science. The proof of scientific discovery as a process is proved by economics, or the fact that we change our relationship to nature. This makes us the highest of sciences, economics. He continues this theme in chapter 5 on how technology is produced. This is where we get those levels of hypothesis, right? Lynn describes the simple hypothesis, which is like the Aristotle one, or where you is what I'm thinking in coherence with already recognized beliefs. Maybe I developed a new thought that would follow from what everybody already accepts, but it's a novel thought. That might be a hypothesis. He contrasts that with a higher hypothesis, where those assumptions themselves are called into question, where the subject of the thought isn't a specific idea that finds its basis in things we all agree on, but where the subject is that the thing we all agreed on was wrong. Basically, a real breakthrough. Kepler, a higher hypothesis. The vicarious hypothesis is a simple hypothesis, and it's shown to be wrong. Then Lynn talked about hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. That is, thinking about how can fruitful higher hypotheses be made. The philosophy of science. And he says that one of the best and clearest examples of a hypothesis of the higher hypothesis is, everybody remember?
They don't know you.
That's in a footnote.
Oh.
It's true. You're right. The cause is not other, and the Riemann habilitation dissertation. So, and then this is where this wonderful section is, which you remember about the creature behind the door. That when you've got you're trying to, okay. You've got the way your mind functions is sometimes surprising to you. Sometimes you have a new thought, and you say, well, why did I get that new thought just now? How did that happen? Where did that come from? How can I have more of those? Is that coming from me, or what's going on? And he describes that the experience can almost be like there's a creature behind a door somewhere in your mind, and that if you pass the creature, paper under the door, when the creature will write back sometimes an answer, a creative answer, a new thought, and that you can best train this creature, make it very happy by passing it constructive geometry problems, for example, and that when you become self-conscious about how, he says, there's people who make discoveries but don't know how it happened. He said, if you've got a worked out hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, it can be possible for you to open that door and recognize that creature as yourself, as your truest self. But look, there's a lot about us. We got personalities, we got things about how we act, how we behave, our pasts, our things that we like, desires. Many of them not very important. They just sort of, like your kind of ice cream you like or something like that. But what's irreducibly, what's unavoidably you? What can always remain as you despite all the changes that you go through? And this creature behind the door is the most you part of you. The way that you respond to changes, the way that you create them, the way that you read, develop your own thoughts, that's you. And when you feel challenged that your thoughts might be wrong, and you realize that you might have a change to make, and that part of your personality might be holding you back, or is holding you back, that there's a certain comfort you can take in that wasn't you anyway. That wasn't a irreducible part of you. It wasn't a part of you that was, inseparable and was going to be with you forever. Almost everything about us can change. And if we reflect back on the last years of our lives, I'm sure we can realize how much we have changed, sometimes very dramatically. Why couldn't that happen in the future? Now, we shouldn't be scared of leaping boldly into the truth, see where it takes you, and your identity can take it, because you're that creature behind the door. All right, that's you. So in the middle of this chapter, Lynn knows he's losing his audience, and he says, let's talk about concentration span now. What prevents people from making concentration span? And why is it sometimes good when giving classes to make dirty jokes? because what are people thinking about sometimes when their minds wander? And he talks about the rise of the Playboy identity. That people's identity shifted from what you do to what you look like, what you consume, what you're seen as, how you're perceived. And that identity is deadly to society. When people's concerns are about how they're perceived, how they believe others will think they enjoy their leisure time, as opposed to what they actually accomplish with themselves, you have no future. You know, you might ask, does popular opinion value having a long concentration span? Like among the things that are considered popularly good, things that people are like, oh, that's really great, I really admire that. You know, having money, that's great, right? Having money, having nice stuff, looking good, being a bold person, I don't know. And how often you hear about people think, wow, you know what? So-and-so's got a really long attention span. You know, the winner of this last music festival, it's amazing. You can carry on a conversation for like 6 hours on all sorts of topics, and they're with you. I don't think that happens. So, unlock that door, that's you. He continues more with this science directly in chapter 6, which is a short but very compact chapter on work and energy. He gives one proposed measure for energy flux density. It's not kilowatts per meter squared, although that's a good one. He calls it kilowatts degrees per meter squared, for example. So you'd be looking, so watts per meter, watt is a flow of energy. So a light bulb is measured in watts. The longer you leave it on, the more kilowatt hours of energy you use. The light bulb's watt rating is the power. Power is a rate of flow of energy, using like the normal physics way of talking about it. Lynn means something different in an economics context. But so Lynn says energy flux density is a flow of energy, watts per meter squared, how density do you have that energy. We also have to keep in mind what's the quality of that energy. So he says, look at the degrees, the temperature of it, as for example. He also says, think about the wavelength of it, for example. You could have a certain amount of energy flowing through an area, but is it red light? Is it an ultraviolet light? Is it an X-ray laser? Same energy can have very different effects depending on what its quality is. And this is where, to get at this, because he's got this point about the quark and about why a universe based on particles is inherently entropic. And that could be a very thorny issue. And we addressed it by writing 2 different briefings on the Ukraine situation, remember? So one briefing was to describe what's going on in Ukraine from the standpoint of particles. And one was to describe what's going on in Ukraine from the standpoint of a whole. So I think that the responses on that one were very good. I think people got it. It was pretty clear, because it's something that we come across every day in organizing. Or do events make history, or does history drive events? And are you going to help people understand things if you start talking about, well, so and so in Ukraine is actually a Nazi, blah 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 blah. Or when you start from the top, that the British Empire is intent to create a war because the financial system is collapsing and this is their last shot. So chapter 7. Now we get into, Lynn's one chapter on what he said in the preface people think all of economics is. This is the chapter on money. And he says, I'm sorry to say it, this might not be considered polite in some circles, but everything you need to know about money can fit in one chapter. And he says the way most people treat this is like putting your pants on your head is the first step to pulling them up your legs. He says there's 2 big problems of the sticking your pants over your heads thing. One is the idea of the magic of the marketplace. The idea that price theory can successfully explain everything in economics. Just think about how much people, you sometimes do this, you do a class and you ask contacts, all right, well, what's, does anybody, what are any of the laws of economics? What are any of the principles of economics? What do you get?
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand, and
The magic of the invisible hand.
the invisible hand. Yeah, so what's that? I don't know.
Buy cheap, sell dear.
Buy cheap and sell dear. Buy sheep and sell deer. Okay. Livestock handling. Buy cheap. Supply and demand. There's one other thing. Usually there's only 2 things you hear. Maybe that's it. Supply and demand and the Anyway, okay, supply. It's like, this is hardly an amazing breakthrough. Did you really need an economic genius that if a lot of people want to buy something and there isn't that much, it'll cost more? I don't know. It hardly seems that profound to me. But building up price theory, people try to say, because they want that to be true, they build up this very complicated system of economics to make that happen. The magic of the marketplace, because prices make everything. Joking, it's like having the magic of letters. Every words are all built out of letters. So if we understand letters and their relationships to each other, we'll all be great poets. It's like an economist saying they're going to explain everything based on prices and supply and demand and, the magic of diction. If you enunciate, whatever you say will be more intelligent. Nope. Well, it wouldn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to speak well. And then the second big thing of sticking the pants on the head is that so much of economics is actually just legitimizing usury. So like I'd said about the preface, you're trying to give backup and support for a political, oligarchical way of running the world. And you say, well, we need a lot of help doing this. So we need to make a really ugly culture so that people don't really think that they could be much better. We need to destroy science so people don't make too many we want to keep that under control. We also, of course, need to have a financial system that allows us to run things. So we need some economists who will explain that it's better that way and that it should be that way. In fact, are you really free as a person if you aren't able to enter into any contract you want to? I mean, isn't that everybody's idea of freedom? That's clearly what the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, I mean, that's this country was fought on, the right to agree to any contract of your choosing. And it's not right to tell people that interest rate's too high and it's usurious. That is hurting personal freedom. So, all of this theory built on that. Lynn says, if you just throw away this obsession with price theory, and then you throw away all of the economics that is actually just to legitimize control by empire, you realize it's actually not that complicated, and you can put it all in one chapter. So this is where Lynn differentiated between the gold reserve system and the gold standard. There was a homework question on that, which was generally the answers on that one were very good. The one important thing to remember, I guess because the question only contrasted those two, the answers didn't really compare it to what we have today, which is a floating system, where money is like anything else and its value can go up and down. So just to review that very quickly, it's important. Under a gold standard, the amount of money is limited by the amount of gold you have. So your economy is limited by metal and the people who control it, which is London. Under a gold reserve system, the gold functions for balance of payments, for dealing with your balance of payments things, like let's say every year with a trading partner country. Your imports and your exports, what's the difference? You'd settle that in gold, but otherwise, domestically, you're able to create credit and you're not limited by the amount of metal that you have. And Michael talked a lot about this today in the weekly report. You compare that to today's floating exchange rate system. So unlike the gold reserve system, today there's nothing fixed between different currencies. Under the gold reserve system, under Bretton Woods, you didn't have to worry about exchange rates fluctuating between different countries, which made it a lot easier to engage in long-term projects. And it means you didn't have to hire Wall Street to write you interest rate options because you didn't have to worry about it because they weren't exchange rate things because they weren't. You didn't need the swaps because they weren't changing. That's part of that legitimizing usury. Wow, because it's an unstable world, you need us to. I mean, how are you going to manage risk without a derivative? Maybe you reduce the risk. Okay, so, and then Lynn gives his criteria for how to issue this credit. How are we going to do this through national banking? How are we going to get this credit out? Just to say a few of the things there. Lynn says you cannot use credit for consumer goods purchases except for a short period of time under extreme need. Where is that credit going to go? It's going to go to the production of capital goods. It's especially going to go to the production of the highest level, the most upstream point in the productive process. So if you've got, and this is one of the homework questions, there were a variety of different firms asking, or cities asking for credit. It went from, producing food to producing clothes to producing machine tools to producing, to building bridges, maglev. And the guiding theme in it was that you need to direct that credit to the highest level, which would be things like infrastructure, including energy, and to things also science, and to the machine tool sector, because if you've got a better machine tool and it's more precise, everything made with it can be better. Everything that those things then make can be better. So you have a real big multiplier factor compared to having a new kind of washing machine, which will make your clothes cleaner or something like that, but it's not going to affect anything else in the productive process. So go for the highest level. He wrote that monetary theory must be based on a pre-calculated effect on the physical economy. No monetary economics is allowed. There are no rules of money itself. It's silly. It's like having rules of words. He also talked about the investment tax credit, which is a great thing. I'm not going to say about it right now. Well, he said you shouldn't tax high income just because it's high. What are people doing with their money? Are you making income and then you're investing it in something that's great? Good. Get a tax credit. But Kennedy had those. It said like, okay, steel mills, you're investing in new equipment. Take the amount that you invested, that you spent for your new equipment, and then when you're filing your taxes with the IRS, take that amount and deduct it from your income. We're not going to count that for your taxes. So that's that's an indirect way of the government helping to finance specific types of investments in different companies without the government actually buying a new drill press and you got the government-owned drill press in the factory or something. Then he ends it with this beautiful thing about what equity really is. It's not about money. It's about a right to immortality. The most fundamental human right isn't the right to enter into your usurious contract because, damn it, you have the right to do whatever you want. It's, do you have the right to know at the time of your death that your life was useful and essential? That's the highest human right. Compare that with the hedonic slavery of these other guys who say, well, just follow your passions. God made the universe so good. If everyone does that, it'll all work out great. And when you're choosing your pleasures and avoiding your pains, don't forget that going against the empire is probably very painful and therefore a bad idea for your life. You won't be happy doing that. You might get killed. So just find out which kind of drugs you like the best. That's freedom. Right. Right. You don't have the right not to be poor or not to think every day at the end of your job, wow, that was useless. But at least you have the right to zone out and not worry about it because you got high at the end of the day. That's freedom. So then he looks at the people that make up the economy. Chapter 8 is on wages and population. Really fun chapter. He talks about education. It's just as you have to invest in it's similar to capital intensity in an economy. How much capital investment are you making in people before they become productive workers? What do they need to know? Are there jobs that require knowing a lot and being able to change what you do? So he says that even as we move into the future and even as we learn more and more and know more and more, education, we're not going to have people getting out of school at the age of 40 in the year 2100. You're not going to say, sorry, you know what, we had to stay until the 20th grade because there's just so much knowledge now, and there's so many bubble tests that you're going to be in school till you're 40. He says, no. When you make breakthroughs on the essentials, on the fundamentals, learning gets easier. So we're not, he says at most, like 25 is sort of an upper age range today for people, getting out of school and doing whatever. Like 25 is you could be out of medical school at 25, for example. And that's pretty old. And then you can't even start working for another couple of years. It's pretty old. He said we're not going to go beyond 25 for anybody. More people might go up to that level, but we're not going to be going beyond that because when we rid education of bad textbooks, incompetent teachers, stupid lesson plans, and although they hadn't been invented yet, he would have said bubble tests or iPad tests or whatever they got now. You can really get a lot done. And I know that's something that convicts get astonished by. It's not something that working on geometry with us or a lot of things, they say, wow, it's so simple. It's easy. Why didn't we do that in school? And it's not because there wasn't enough time. It's not like doubling the square takes like 4 weeks of study or something, or the Pythagorean theorem takes like a whole year. I mean, okay. So then the other, this other great polemic that Lynn makes at the end of the chapter is about the plumber and the mechanic and who's driving the car, and about putting things in context. So he makes this beautiful organizing point from the standpoint of economics and industry, where he says, let's say that you've got a...
Yeah, it's still...
There we go. Let's say that you've got a machine, and it's got belts and pulleys and wheels and moves around, and there's some part of it that you replace with a laser. So presumably this might be some sort of cutting machine. The rest of it's all the same, but you've got this laser cutter there now, and so now it can chomp through twice as much metal in a day. You didn't change any of the rest of it. You didn't change the gears and the pulleys and the belts and the axles or whatever. How valuable are each of those parts now? The whole machine got more efficient in what it could do in a day because you replaced one part of it with a laser. But the whole machine became more valuable. If it does twice as much, it's twice as valuable now. So that gear just became twice as valuable. That belt that's driving it and moving it around and positioning it is twice as valuable. That power cord where you plug it into the wall, twice as valuable. So he says same thing with people. He says plumbing hasn't changed dramatically recently, but what are you plumbing? Are you plumbing a building built for financial services? Are you plumbing an executive bathroom at Chase Manhattan? Or are you plumbing a laboratory at a national lab? Same kind of work, but the value of it, just like that gear in the machine, depends on what the whole thing's doing. So the same thing with the mechanic, he says. How valuable is the job of a mechanic? Doing an oil change. Yeah, I mean, part of it's doing a good oil change, but then, well, what's the car going to be used for? Is the car being driven by a pimp? Is the car being driven by some industrial person? He says about a farmer. He says, somebody who's working in a scientific field, they have breakfast, maybe they have a bowl of cereal, they drink milk. You don't have a more high-tech cow. You don't have a fusion-powered udder or something. You get milk out the same way. But that milk is more valuable because of the person drinking it is more valuable. The farmer's work is more valuable, even if they're not directly using new technologies, although they probably will be if we're having them. So he says on page 163, he's got this great quote. He says, for better or for worse, each of us is a person of universal significance. Every person lives in universal history. And the homeworks on this I thought were great. As people described different jobs that they had in the past, and what kind of value they took out of that job. Like people described working at Quiznos as, not being all that rewarding. But then even doing good things. Someone had been helping, helping somebody, other people learn how to read. And it seems like a good thing to be doing. But what's the context? What's the whole society doing? You might feel good about that, but it's not, are you actually doing something good? Are you actually doing the best thing you could be doing? Are you acting according to the presumptive will of God? Nope. It's a bigger project. So it's when we act on that level of changing the context for everybody that we're being as fully human as we could be. And that's the joyous job that we have. We got the best job. So chapter 9, infrastructure. And this is a fun chapter. So he starts by talking about infrastructure, then he talks about the oligarchy, then he talks about infrastructure again. So he opens up, he says, look, we've done economic studies, and we found the biggest correlation in economics was between investment in infrastructure and then growth in the productive powers of labor. Huge correlation. You invest in infrastructure, well, within a year, your productive powers of labor go up. He says, but now let's look at this. Why has that not been happening? And then he goes through, basically it's like a 2-page version of Treason in America. He goes through, the families, the we versus they, the families, the oligarchy that has hated the U.S. and wanted to prevent its development, in countries around the world, to prevent development. He says, so going to these groups with proof that, hey, We're not investing in our infrastructure. This is catastrophic. They're not going to care. That's the point. So he says, well, is this a conspiracy then? Yes. But he says most people recognize the conspiracy wrongly. They look one level down from where it's really happening. You see the lackeys, and it seems like a conspiracy. Partly because you can't figure out why they would be doing what they're doing. He says the real action takes place a little higher among these families, among the we, who simply say, something ought to be done about that. And then, the rest of the gang gets into action on it. That's where it's really happening. And he said people make this mistaken idea about these conspiracies as being based on greed. The emotional drive behind Queen Elizabeth, it's not greed. It's the sort of thing you kind of don't want to put your mind in the ability to even understand what her emotional life is like. But you get it with Zeus. I mean, it's that Zeusian outlook. Zeus wasn't greedy. Zeus didn't say, hey, I want all the gold and all the money. Zeus had an idea about himself as the ruler and people as animals, to be destroyed or done whatever you please with. That's not greed. That's oligarchism. That's Zeus. So that's one of the, Lynn identifies that as being this problem with people looking at conspiracies, that it's not greed. It's Zeus. Go all the way on that one. And then just one other interesting thing from there is the cost of depreciation. He says if we don't maintain our infrastructure, rebuild it with higher levels, that's not money that we saved. That's a cost that we simply didn't write on our books. If you've got something, you let it fall apart, and you say, well, I saved money on maintenance. I didn't have to do any repairs. Well, then your car breaks down. I mean, all along the way, it was losing its value, and you simply just didn't write that down. So he says, where is he gave a figure of $3 trillion even back then, in '84, of the amount needed to get infrastructure up to snuff. Today, the American Society of Civil Engineers says $3.6 trillion, which seems kind of low, considering how big Lynn thought it was in '84. Although there are figures, anyway. So you'd say, well, during that time, if you're saying, well, our GDP has been great, our income's been great, did you include the fact that you were primitive accumulating? Did you include that cost? So then after talking about these awful oligarchs, he talks about the cities of the future, and he says we should design them based on what it would be like to live on the moon. And we should build these things tough, ready for hundreds of years, cities to last centuries. Start with the infrastructure, make it incredibly good and durable. And it'll cost a lot, but it's worth it. And when we've got 50% of the population being productive, we're not going to be poor, and we'll be able to do things that involve a lot of investment and cost because there's so many people producing. So it'll work. And then in chapter 10, he says, pass Glass-Steagall. Chapter 10 is about inflation. And like I said at the beginning, because it came up from the homework questions. Lynn talks about kinds of inflation, but then he says, look, the biggest type of inflation is the tax of Wall Street. That these guys make funny money or are given $85 billion a month by the government. Quantitative with the easing, bailouts, everything else. Speculation. You create money. That money can be used to buy things. It can be used to say, hey, this thing that you made, I'm going to take that now. It's basically a tax on everybody else. They said, you want to wipe out inflation? Don't worry about credit. Worry about Wall Street. They're the ones causing the inflation by creating huge amounts of money without contributing anything in the process while they're doing so. It's just stealing.
This was the year that Alan Greenspan was writing Rethinking Glass-Steagall.
Oh yeah? 84. Oh wow. So Lynn was pre-thinking Glass-Steagall. Anyway. So that's like a short version of the book. There's so much in this book. What a good book. It's really well composed. So we can talk about things. I just wanted to lay out. You'll find in the video description a quick survey and about the class and a final homework proposal, which could be, these are some of the ideas that had come in. Either one, find an article about economics that's bad. It should be very easy. So an article, an op-ed, letter to the editor, whatever it is, respond to it using concepts from So You Wish, and see if you can get it published. So that's an idea. Number 2 would be plan out a class or a class series. So, or how you would implement it. You know, how are you going to get people to it? How's it going to work out? In other words, how are we going to get this stuff across to more people? How are we going to recruit people with it? And the third idea is to, this one's tough given how bad the statistics are, but make an economic hypothesis and then pull together numbers to make your point. In other words, make a chart for organizing, you might think of it as. So, you know, some of the ones that we tried along the way were more difficult than others. You might not put percentages of C, V, D, and S prime on a sign, you know, at a table. But some of the things in terms of doing intelligence, like how do you get outside of money? One of the things we talked about last week was how, you know, EIR would pull together these figures of average weekly paychecks to pay for fill in the blank. So a typical family's insurance premiums, how many weeks of paychecks does that cost? Typical family's mortgage or rent over a year, how many paychecks does that cost? So that's a way to, you know, it pulls you out of money and then lets you make a specific statement about, hey, here's where things are going, here's where we are. Or if you look at a time from the past when things were good, such as with the Apollo program or with Roosevelt's New Deal projects, you might be able to make a wonderful point about what we can expect moving forward with the same economic system. So those are some ideas for a final project, and that's that. So it's been a very fun time. Anybody have any thoughts, reflections, questions, tears to shed? Joy, okay. Tears of joy. It's over.
Well, I have one
It's
observation.
definitely been a lot of fun and very helpful in the field. Like talking to people out in the population, it's been very helpful, this class series.
Good. Not totally abstract and hard to apply at all.
Yeah, I think that's true. It'll give you you have a solid foundation by which to so that you can talk to people without and know that you're not talking about something populist. You're not talking according to popular opinion. If your intention over the course of the call is this person has to get a principle from, so you wish, from the corpus of Lynn's work, you know. But now you have a much deeper, at least I know I do, have a much deeper and broader conception of what that is. I also think that we should, that the handful of people who really were closely involved in this class, that we should generate a lot of excitement and urgency around the next phase of the Wednesday process, because we should just have a big leap from only a handful of people regularly doing the homework to having 15 people on this who are newer members or of a certain type who are putting that out, because it's true. I mean, it was a great benefit to be able to read other people's answers and see how people think things through, and then to incorporate that into your own idea of what we're doing. So I'll just make that plug, right?
Yeah, what I've been discussing here with the SF crew is just this idea of taking it and bringing more young people and just people in the population to actually be able to know, because I mean what we're doing out on in the population is we're educating people on a way to rethink the way that they're used to thinking. And I mean that's what LaRouche's So You Wish book it really gets at, is actually being able to understand the American system way of thinking about economics instead of what we grew up in school, learning in school, which is the British form of history and economics, which is completely backwards and false. And we actually have the opportunity to give them the insight of what it is to be a real American. And we just, that we've been just discussing here how we have to really start bringing people into a more of a class series here to actually get people who are wanting to be more close to be involved in that process, relearning the American system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the next phase of this is going to be on Kusa and Kepler, which it applies differently. I mean, this is obviously, you know, economic polemics you can obviously use directly, you know, constantly. And one aspect, as you brought up about the American system compared to the British stuff that we're taught and inundated with in schools, this idea that Adam Smith is the foundation of the United States, which is so stupid, you know. They say Cornwallis is, you know, the basis of West Point or something. I don't know. The other aspect is also the honesty in it, and the fact that it's a scientific discovery. This is the scientific practice of economics. This isn't who can get their ideas put out so that they can gain some sort of benefit from it. You know, this isn't just like playing politics, the practice of economics. It's a real science. And, you know, taking part in, I mean, this is a scientific discovery. You know, Lynn, this is a discovery. Okay, this book's a discovery. So, you know, in terms of some of these next phases on Kusa and Kepler, and developing or refreshing, as the case may be, you know, a real understanding of what science is, of learning more about that creature behind the door, that is essential for having an idea of what it is to be a person. I mean, that's a certain human aspect of us and of everybody around us that has to be touched. So the same, you know, music touches people, culture touches people. It touches something inside them that they didn't know that they had, and they're going to resonate with it. And in terms of pulling people up out of ugliness and desperation and just the environment around us, when you help people realize they've got something beautiful and creative in themselves that they share with every other person, this is the true nature of the human species. This is the true nature of our fellow men and women. That gives you a strength to say, you know, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna join to do, you know, to really So it's going to be a different phase from the, you know, the outside appearance in terms of where we're going next, but it's as essential. It's not indirectly related to organizing. It is an understanding of what we need to touch and develop in people that we're talking to, and in general in the human species as a whole, so that we have a culture that's making the breakthroughs that are needed on fusion, on antimatter, on biology as biology, so we don't all, you know, die of staph infections or something in 2 decades.
I think this is a really critical point in terms of the well, just the how are you going to be the question of educating the population and educating your context, because if you're thinking about this is the question of a horizontal style of organizing versus a vertical style of organizing, I think, because it's extremely important for the phone work that you can see yourself as educating a person along a certain curriculum of a sort. The field work lends itself to a kind of a one-shot deal, you know, a one-night stand, right? So you have like, so you're just trying to get across some like one sharp idea, generally, and there's exceptions to that, but that's generally the way it works. And then there's a kind of a lower level phone organizing, where you're just calling, where you're calling new people, and which people we really don't do nearly enough of in the organization in terms of really focusing on the upgrade work. But even when people do that, then it tends to be, again, like a sort of a one-shot deal. Okay, I can definitely go deeper. I can have a certain kind of a higher quality of a dialogue with a person, but it's going to be one go, and then I'm going to get it, and then, you know, and then we'll pick it up later, and I don't know. You don't have a plan at that point. Whereas the absolute best organizing that we do in the organization is where you actually have faith in the other person having a mind, and you seek to develop them over a period, which means being able to look at Lynn's work in physical economy and see it as a developing concept, and not just something singular in terms of you know, not because I've heard this, you know, you hear this with people. You hear this with people who have long-term contacts where every time they get on the phone they're having the same discussion, and then it crashes eventually because the person says, well, you know, eventually this kind of wears off, and the person starts to distrust you, I think, because you're just talking about the same thing over and over again, as opposed to, and you're basically saying, trust me, trust me, trust me, and the person's going to trust you at first because you mean it. But if you don't have something, if you don't have a way to convey to them, to give them the foundation that you have, then then nothing's going to happen.
Anything else?
Thanks, Jason.
You're welcome. All right, well, that'll wrap up this series then. If you have watched this class somehow without seeing or knowing about the rest of them, you'll find the link to the full series in the video description. Also, the homework assignments that are in every video description, you'll find the links there. You know, some of them say what the due date is in them. That was during the original class series. But feel free, also anybody watching this right now, if you haven't done any of the ones in the past and you'd like to in the future, feel free to do those homeworks and then send them to the email address in those homework documents. Send them in later. We'll get back to you. So it's not too late if you missed it the first time around and you're watching this later. So, thanks for joining.
Well, let's give Jason a round.
Thanks. All right, see you.